What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's Daniel here from the GeekSpeakNation channel, and yeah, we have a TV show to talk about. So originally, I actually already had a video recorded for a review of Tiger King. I recorded it earlier on this week. I had watched the whole entire documentary, all 7 episodes in one day. And then it was like the day after, or 2 days later, I ended up recording a review for it. However, as time passed and I did a little bit more research into the making of this documentary and the people behind it, I found certain things to be a little bit questionable when it came to the Tiger King documentary, and more so the idea of representation in a documentary. So for those of you who don't know, while I was in college, I graduated, but while I was in college, I worked as a documentary filmmaker. Yes, I know. yes, what? And the number one thing I learned from working on documentaries is that every single choice that you make is deliberate. You have a plethora of footage to pick from, but at the end of the day, you still have to tell a concrete story. And every single choice you end up making and putting on the chopping block has to be there for a certain reason, and has to be validated. And oftentimes it ends up saying a lot about the project, about the things that you end up cutting out or the things that you end up leaving out. I think when I go back and I think about projects I ended up working on when I was back in college, we had this one documentary we worked on for a year about this church that was in our area that had been around since it was the year after the Civil War ended. We were working on a documentary about this church. And over the course of working on that, we had gathered so much information about the church, the congregation, the history of it, how we're intertangled with the overall community that the church was placed in. And it was really interesting to see how many stories there were that this was able to tie into in the overall community, but some of it we ended up having to leave out just for the simple fact of time constraints. Now, what does all this have to do with Tiger King? It came out in a lot of recent information that they left out a lot of information about Joe Exotic, especially when it came to a lot of his drug abuse and when it came to a lot of his racism, which I thought was very, very interesting. And the directors, they came out and they said that they decided to cut out a lot of Joe Exotic's racism because it didn't fit the story, which was interesting because when you look at the documentary overall, I don't understand how this isn't about the complexity of Joe Exotic. You know, where it's not about his personality, where it's not about his personal life and understanding who this person is and how his mentality ended up affecting the decisions that he made and how he communicated with people and how he interacted with people and how did that not affect the overall outcome of where he ended up being. I thought it was very, very interesting that they decided to leave that out. And in their own words, and I'm not doing this quote directly, but the gist of what one of the directors ended up saying was, oh yeah, Joe is definitely a racist and or a bigot, and over the course of the 5 years that we filmed with them, he ended up getting a bit better, but we would definitely say he's very racist. And they said it didn't come from a place of hate. It was more so he was just ignorant. And it was like, okay, but I feel like that's relevant to the overall discussion that we have here. And the reason this matters is because the documentary overall plays with perspective. It plays with the audience's perspective of these people. It plays with the interview subjects and how they view each other between Joe Exotic and Carol Baskin, and then Joe Findlay and how he views John Findlay and how he views Joe. Every single character has their own perspective, and the audience has their own perspective. And the number one thing to keep in mind that when it comes to documentarians is that they're human. They're people too. And as the number one thing, documentaries are almost supposed to be like journalism in certain ways, depending on the way that you're doing your subject matter. You know, most journalism, we want it to be, unbiased, and we want it to be objective, unless we're specifically looking for that writer or that specific creator to make something that is very biased or not, or what have you, if that's what you're looking for. But that same principle ends up kind of going for documentaries, and that's the way that they try to present themselves in Tiger King. And by them, I mean the directors and the kind of the creative staff overall, that they're being very neutral and very unbiased in presenting these perspectives. However, that's not the case when you hear that they cut out a whole bunch of stuff about, you know, what Joe has done or what he said, or things that would ruin the public perspective of him, especially after this documentary has come out. And if all that footage of that has been cut out over the past 5 years of his innate or problematic bigotry has been cut out, that messes with the perspective that they're trying to tell, and that's why they leave it out. And to me, it's not about the perspective of, black guys mad at racism and racism needs to be exposed. I mean, yeah, sure, I guess that's a part of it, but my number one thing is, it's interesting to see how the creators were able to manipulate the audience into caring about Joe and give this distorted perception of him through the manipulation of where footage is placed, right? And that's the number one thing I learned about, like I said, about making documentaries, is how every single thing matters, how every single detail matters. And when you put that into perspective of everything that has to do with Joe, a lot of times anything that's negative about Joe, whether it's his drug use or the way it seems that, you know, the way he treated John, and I think Travis was his name, the way he treated those two, it seems that he had them hopped up on meth most of the time and tricking them into thinking they were gay for the most part, and having them hooked on substances in order to keep them around. They often try to soften that up with, well, you think Joe was a little bit lost, or Joe had this in his upbringing, or then we're gonna off-cross this with something maybe that Carol says about Joe, and you can't trust Carol, she probably killed her husband. It's very, very interesting, because this documentary truly is a masterclass in sensationalism and a masterclass in how do you make somebody iconic without fully exposing who they are. Because at the end of the day, by the time you get to the end of this documentary, at the end of all 7 hours, you get a sense of who Joe is, but there's definitely a bigger sense of, not only with Joe, but even with people like Doc Antle and with Jeff. There's such a strong emphasis on, there's so much that has not been told, and there's so much that's being kept back about what these people are really, really up to. So yeah, I just found that kind of upsetting and kind of problematic looking into it afterwards. And especially, like, this even shows up in the example of when you're talking about John Finley. John ended up saying in an interview that they had interviewed him about 4 or 5 times, but they still ended up only using the interview where they kind of coaxed him into being shirtless, and he's sitting there in the couch with no shirt on, and he has most of his teeth missing and all that stuff. And they coaxed him into doing that because they knew it would look better doing it that way, like, oh, look at this, he's his character. But from what he tries to describe, even though he kind of does it in a coy way, they try to convince him into doing it, saying like, oh, you're kind of the sexy one out of the bunch, so do it with your shirt off. All these little details matter because they're all about creating and painting a perspective. And I think it's just important to recognize that, because a lot of this happens in the media that we end up watching. And everything is finely tuned and finely crafted to create a certain perspective. From the editing choices to whose interview do you cut to next, from whose dialogue is going on to what you do and do not put in the documentary. I think it's very, very interesting to analyze in that perspective as compared to the overall documentary, because it is a well done documentary. I'm not lying about that. I made a whole separate video actually reviewing the documentary. But looking back at it now, it feels a lot different looking at this subject, this piece overall, when, you know, so much was omitted or so much was distorted in order for entertainment value. And I think it's a bit foolish. I think it's a bit naive to say this wasn't distorted to make Joe a likable character, because look at social media. Look at how much, you know, not only the people involved are eating it up, but the creators are doing interview after interview. People are eating this up. Joe's a meme now. He's trending. His music is trending. All this sort of stuff. They made him this icon. People are rushing to say he needs to be released out of prison early. He doesn't deserve this sentence. More people should be going to prison. All this other stuff. More things should be investigated. And in some cases, yes, some things definitely need to be more investigated, especially Doc Antle and his possible underage whatever stuff was going on, which is absolutely disgusting. But yeah, I think there's a lot more to it than meets the eye, and I think that's just the most unsettling thing about it, is just how he was made to be this icon because that's the perspective he wanted to give off to people, and they still maintain that in the documentary while trying to peel back the layers of who he is, but not fully show it to the audience, which is, I don't know, I just feel like it's a little bit problematic, because I feel like they're just trying to profit off of a very problematic person for entertainment purposes, and that's a lot of puzz, which is a lot of alliteration. But I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I'm not. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comment sections down below. I'm not trying to start some, you know, big brain race war discussion, anything like that. But I think it is interesting and kind of problematic that they would hold back on who this person was in order to make him more appealing and more sympathetic to the audience. And they even admit themselves that they had empathy for this man, and that's part of the reason why that they held back on this. And is that fair, to pull your punches because you like the person and that you deem it that it's not necessarily relevant to the story, even though at the end of the day this is a story about Joe Exotic and Carol Baskin, not about the Tigers? Especially, like, it starts off in the beginning that it is, but by the end of it, just like how Joe and all of them left the park to degrade, the overall message about animal conservation and caring about the animals, that message degraded throughout the entire course of the documentary, and then it gets brought up as this afternote foot-thought at the end. And like I said, I'm not trying to start a fight, I'm just trying to start an honest discussion about this, because, you know, it's a very big thing in media nowadays when we're talking about, you know, fake news and all this sorts of stuff, and can you trust your sources? But it's interesting when that discussion kind of bleeds over to our entertainment, and when something is trying to be presented as factual as possible, but what happens if some of the supplementary evidence is kind of missing or a little bit oblique? What happens in that regard? I think it's a very, very interesting discussion, and it's one that's worth having, and I hope we have a nice, friendly discussion about this in the comment sections down below. Regardless, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm Daniel, and don't forget to get geeky.